Welcome everyone to Black Ops 101. Today we are going to be discussing covert operations and exposing some dark secrets about the CIA. Going to blow through lots of material today to try and paint you the big picture of the conspiracy that Q is designed to get rid of. In this episode, I will be explaining how the CIA uses terrorists and criminals as assassins, how they fund Black Ops almost exclusively with heroin and human trafficking, how John McCain was the secret kingpin, how the corrupt news media has always turned a blind eye, and how CIA Black Ops enabled a bunch of worthless European royals to conquer the United States. Our first topic for today is assassins. Assassins have shaped much of world history, from ancient times to modern politics. They've been used to provoke wars, stage coups, derail competitors, and suppress or steal scientific innovations. Whether they care to admit it or not, every leader of every country has assassins they can call if they need to. But no one has more assassins than the CIA and MI6. The first thing any assassin needs to be successful is a good cover or good disguise. Freemasonry is one of the oldest forms of cover for assassins. Back in the day, cities were much smaller and nobody except rich people and royals really traveled, meaning it was really hard to go somewhere new without being immediately noticed and talked about by everyone. So in order to get access to foreign targets, it was easiest to use Freemasons as cover. Expert stonemason subcontractors who traveled together wherever their building skills were needed at a given time. While Freemasons still exist, and some of their symbols are still used as signals by British and American intelligence services, they are rarely used as actual cover anymore. For most of the past century, American assassins used diplomats, aid organizations, and religious missions as cover. That's why the CIA is organized under the State Department. University professors, multinational corporations, and touring musicians have also been used as cover for intelligence operatives throughout our nation's history. But with the advent of smartphones, social media, HD video surveillance, and AI, these covers have become nearly impossible to pull off. That's why intel agencies have shifted to indirect assassination methods, like using terrorists, gangs, mass shooters, and acts of God. Indirect assassination methods have been around for a long time, but they were usually only used in sensitive cases. Like the anarchists who provoked World War I by killing Archduke Ferdinand, and the iceberg, quote-unquote, that took down the Titanic, killing several business moguls that were impeding the establishment of the corrupt U.S. Federal Reserve. These days, with all the technology we have, indirect assassination methods have become standard procedure, which is pretty scary if you think about it, because indirect assassination methods often involve not just killing the target, but lots of innocent bystanders as well. Some examples of indirect assassinations would be the Saudi terrorists on 9/11, the sabotage Boeing planes that crashed in Ethiopia and Indonesia, the Las Vegas concert shooter at Mandalay Bay, and the MS-13 narco children that shot Seth Rich. All are examples of meticulously planned intelligence ops, not just random tragic events they are officially described to be. Many people refer to those tragedies as inside jobs, which is technically false because the CIA is technically forbidden from conducting operations on American soil. So they launder their criminality by outsourcing the operations conducted here to foreign intel services like MI6. Foreign intel services that have diplomatic immunity, so they legally can't be prosecuted no matter what they do, as well as unrestrained, warrantless access to all of our calls, emails, text messages, and location data through an incredibly shady intelligence sharing agreement we have with them called Five Eyes. Since 1947, MI6 and the CIA have scratched each other's backs by using these outrageous legal loopholes to tee off on each other's quote-unquote problematic domestic political opponents. Problematic American leaders like President John F. Kennedy, Attorney General Bobby Kennedy, and civil rights leaders Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr., and problematic Anglosphere leaders like Australian Prime Minister Harold Holt and British MP Joe Cox, to name just a few. So that's a little bit about cover. Now on to funding sources. Throughout history, opium, aka heroin, has been a key funding source of clandestine operations. especially European history. Over the past few hundred years, House Wettin, the medieval royal bloodline that secretly controls the world, has used opium and human trafficking to finance their brutal imperial endeavors. Their use of opium as a weapon of war goes back to the days of the Pirates of the Caribbean, when there was an intense rivalry going between Britain and Spain for dominance of the Americas. In the 1500s, the original Queen Elizabeth was feeling left behind, so she authorized a practice called privateering, which essentially is a legal version of piracy where she would use private mercenaries to attack and plunder Spanish treasure ships carrying gold back from the Americas. It was a way for Queen Elizabeth to get a piece of the action without provoking a full-scale war with Spain, who was way bigger and badder than them at the time. During this period, British operatives pioneered many of the clandestine tactics and networks they ultimately used to become the preeminent world superpower they became in the 1800s. Tactics such as using opium, aka heroin, and human trafficking to fund pirate colonies throughout the Caribbean to keep the money flowing when there weren't Spanish ships to attack. The name MI6 comes from this time period. It's short for Marine Intelligence Unit 666, which at the time was a cheeky Satanism reference, clowning on the Spanish conquistadors' pretense of brutally colonizing America so they could bring the native peoples to God. The British had a mantra of pioneers take the arrows, settlers take the land. So they would often let other imperial powers go places first and bear the tremendous upfront costs of building colonial outposts before sending their spies and assassins to hijack them by force. Later on, after they defeated the Spanish Armada, the British reorganized their savage horde of pirates into the East India Company, which they then used as the primary vehicle of their ruthless imperialism for the next several hundred years. At its peak, the British East India Company had a private army of about 260,000 men, roughly twice the size of the British Army, and they dominated opium and slave trafficking worldwide. It served as the tip of the British military spear, directly ruling over India for over 100 years and eventually going to war with China for trying to outlaw their heroin dealing. Twice, as a matter of fact. The Chinese government still cites the opium wars to this day whenever they're called out for selling fentanyl to Mexican drug cartels. Heroin dealing is such a staple of British power that they use a poppy pin instead of a yellow ribbon to honor their dead soldiers. Poppies are the flower that heroin is derived from. The British royals claim that the poppy was adopted after World War I because it symbolized the flowers that grew in the fields after the battles took place. But it's really because they used heroin-financed anarchist assassins to incite a vast war, seize key territories in the Middle East, and consolidate vast power over Europe, Africa, and the rest of the world. Power they would use to set the stage for another major world war that would give them the opportunity to conquer back their ultimate prize, the United States of America. As World War II was breaking out, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, a slimy robber baron heir whose grandfather made his fortune smuggling heroin to China, allowed British intelligence to come over and essentially build the precursor to the CIA, called OSS, from the ground up, teaching Americans all the gangsterific spy agency tactics they had developed over the centuries. From that point on, British and American intel ops became deeply intertwined, especially when it came to controlling organized crime and using it to finance covert operations. The idea was sold to American leaders on the pretense that drug dealing and prostitution was going to happen either way, so they might as well control it and use the money that it generates for their ops. But that always was a pipe dream, and what really ended up happening was the United States getting corrupted from within and dragged into endless foreign wars. Wars that are ultimately used to enact the medieval imperial agenda of the British Empire and to facilitate more heroin cultivation, like in Vietnam and Afghanistan. Ever thought about how weird it is that Afghanistan is currently growing 3 times as much heroin as it was when we invaded in 2001? But as I mentioned earlier, drug dealing isn't the only funding source for our intelligence operations. Human trafficking is too. Human trafficking is another ancient industry controlled by intelligence services, and it is even more sadistic than the heroin game. If you've ever seen the movie Taken, that sort of a situation where the girl is being sold off at auction is very real and happens much more often than you'd think. Another good depiction is the Avicii music video For a Better Day. If you ever wonder why Avicii was suicided, look no further than that video he made. And they don't just use sex trafficking to raise money, they also use it to exercise power. If you've ever seen the movie Red Sparrow with Jennifer Lawrence, you'll see a depiction of what's called a honeypot, or a special type of spy operation that lures powerful men into compromising sexual activities and then uses the pictures from that activity to blackmail them. British and American spy agencies frequently use this method to exercise control over billionaires who aren't afraid of politicians. That's why they created Jeffrey Epstein and Sex Island, to use as a mega honeypot. Epstein would get rich and powerful people to have sex with children so he could get compromising photos on them and own them for life. That's why Robert Mueller stepped in and got him off with a slap on the wrist when Acosta tried to prosecute him in Florida. Because as the documents clearly state, Epstein belonged to intelligence. Pretty crazy, right? And they let most of the other small-time traffickers run wild too. I witnessed this firsthand doing overnight IT work for hotel chains like Hilton, Marriott, Embassy Suites, Hamilton Inn, and La Quinta. How young girls would go into a room early in the evening and have different men coming and going every hour, almost all night long. And how major hotel chains and local police brazenly look the other way as child sex trafficking is happening right under their noses. When I brought it up with one of the governor's top officials, how people in power are turning a blind eye to corruption, he shrugged and said everyone does that, Republicans and Democrats. And he's not wrong, unfortunately. That ridiculous attitude is why the website Backpage was created and launched in Arizona. Backpage was essentially a giant Craigslist for prostitutes that operated on a worldwide scale. Backpage turbocharged our human trafficking problem, enriching criminal gangs and their CIA overlords in the process. It made pimping so easy that their only problem was what to do with all that money they were making. Which brings me to how I originally discovered the CIA's gangbanging racket, through its money laundering ops here in Arizona. Several of whom are my customers, businesses I sold point-of-sale systems to. Turns out I have lots of friends in common with the guy who was the CIA's head gangbanger. Someone you might recognize. If you've ever seen the TV show Scandal, there's a shadowy covert intelligence agency called B6, which is an artistic rendition of the real thing called D6, the covert paramilitary wing of the CIA. Both in the show and in real life, the guy who runs covert operations is called Command and doesn't answer to anyone, not even the president. The purpose of the command role in real life was to organize black ops around an admiral, a top military leader that would be able to operate on 30 to 40 year time horizons as opposed to a series of presidents who operate on 4 to 8. Admiralty law in the military was created before a time of instantaneous communications, so it gives Navy admirals legal authority to order strikes without pre-approval from the president. It was intended to be used for situations where an enemy surprise attacks and the admiral needs to order an immediate response to avoid catastrophe. But over the years, it turned into a corrupt loophole used to order assassinations, with or without the consent of the elected president. Command also functions as a very important PR figurehead. All of the CIA mockingbirds in the mainstream media echo Command talking points verbatim, manufacturing the public consent they need to perpetuate their racket regime change wars. As I mentioned earlier, John McCain was Command, the guy secretly running D6. Almost everything our kangaroo news media tells us about McCain is false, especially the idea that he was some kind of patriotic veteran who was always putting his country first. In real life, he was actually a vicious war criminal and an opioid-addicted pedophile who saw himself as more of a European king than an American serviceman. That's why he constantly bragged about his royal ancestry and always used his power to enact the imperial agenda of those worthless European royals instead of using it to protect the interests of the American people. To understand how John McCain became command, we need to understand a little bit about his background. John McCain was born on a military base in the Panama Canal Zone, land which had just been broken off from Colombia by a US-backed puppet revolution. While in Panama, he made friends with Colombian rebels that would assist him in future endeavors. Throughout his childhood, John McCain did terrible in school. All of his classmates and teachers thought he was a total prick. Like his obnoxious daughter, he was a snotty little brat who got everything handed to him on a silver platter because of who his powerful father was. One of the top admirals in the Navy, akin to something like military royalty. While in the Naval Academy, his teachers and classmates nicknamed him McNasty because he was such an arrogant jerk to everyone. He graduated almost last in his class, and the only reason he wasn't expelled is because his father was an admiral and could keep getting him out of trouble. After graduating, he bounced around in a few roles before deciding to become a fighter pilot. While he was training, he crashed 3 separate military jets, all due to pilot error. The first was off the coast of Texas. The second was in Spain when he was trying to showboat and accidentally took out a power line, causing a major power outage and sparking a major international incident. The third one was one of the military training jets his corrupt admiral father would let him use for personal weekend joyrides to see girlfriends and sporting events in other states. The McCain family perfectly epitomizes the insane nepotism corrupting our military. Any other pilot would have been grounded after one crash, but John was untouchable because his father was an admiral. On his very first deployment, John recklessly caused a major fire on the deck of the USS Forrestal that killed 134 of his fellow seamen. After again facing zero consequences for his actions, he was reassigned to another ship and back in action almost immediately. He was shot down in Vietnam after disobeying a direct stand-down order while trying to bomb a light bulb factory. The only reason they were able to shoot him down is because, once again, he wasn't following established Navy procedures and flying at the right altitude, which made him an easy target. He was severely injured in the crash and immediately turned on the United States in exchange for medical treatment. Being the son of the admiral that was running the war, Songbird McCain was able to provide mountains of invaluable intel to the Viet Cong, intel they used to shoot down many more American pilots. It was during this time that he developed his lifelong addiction to opioids. He was never actually tortured. That's just a lie made up to justify his treason. Because he was such a huge liability, providing so much damaging intel to the enemy, the Navy made a prisoner swap deal to get him out as soon as possible. But in the political power move of the century, John refused release until his fellow prisoners were freed. He pretended it was a selfless and patriotic act, and the news media ate it up hook, line, and sinker. But the real reason he refused to be released was because he wanted to avoid being court-martialed for treason. After a few years, he was eventually pardoned by President Nixon as part of a power struggle with military leaders over leaving the war in Vietnam. The instant he got home, he immediately ditched his wife and child who had been anxiously waiting years and years for his return and started an extramarital affair with Cindy Hensley, a crime family heiress from Arizona. Another great example of how ruthless and cold-hearted this guy was. After divorcing his first wife and remarrying Cindy Hensley in 1980, the stage was set. And he took over the D6 command role by default after his father died unexpectedly in 1981. His dad, John McCain II, or Admiral McCain, was the original command. Admiral McCain originally got the job when the OSS was restructured into the CIA in 1947 because he ran the Navy Signals Intelligence base in Italy after the war. At the time, the Navy was who ran all U.S. signals intelligence, so the CIA had to work through them to facilitate their spying and gangbanging. Admiral McCain, along with some of his other insanely corrupt admiral friends, were some of the first naive buffoons to buy into the idea of a new world order. They worked with vile racketeers like CIA Director John Dulles to import mobsters from places like Italy, Sicily, and Ireland, and helped them take over many of America's major cities. When his son took over in 1981, he immediately shifted the focus away from the Italian and Irish mobsters his dad preferred, and instead ramped up operations with his old amigos in the Colombian cartels, people he knew from his childhood in Panama, leading to the cocaine and crack epidemic throughout the 80s and 90s. He also ingratiated himself with the crime families of Arizona, like Charles Keating, and got himself into Congress by taking over the seat held by John Jacob Rhodes, the sketchy MI6 double agent who helped swift-boat President Nixon for leaving the war in Vietnam. After a couple of terms in Congress, he took over the Senate seat of another Nixon-sniping MI6 00 gangster named Barry Goldwater. Rhodes and Goldwater were the worthless, fake do-gooding rhinos of their day. Being in Congress provided John McCain the access and legal immunities he needed to run D6 efficiently. Another thing that really helped was the partnership he made with the Clintons that provided them assassins and saboteurs to cover for their corruption in exchange for favorable coverage in the media mafia he needed to cover for his corruption. This secret partnership enabled them to sell us out while enriching themselves with racket charities funded primarily by foreign robber barons. The Saudis, the Soroses, and the Rothschilds, aka the Eye, ushering in an unprecedented worldwide era of wanton corruption and sadistic violence. From El Salvador to Libya to Syria to Ukraine to Kyrgyzstan, John McCain sowed chaos, degeneracy, and violence everywhere he went. Especially out here in Arizona. Arizona is still very much the Wild West. Marauding Depression-era crime families operate with virtual impunity here to this very day. Families like the Hensleys, John McCain's in-laws who control commercial alcohol distribution, and families like the Bashas, who run a prominent local grocery store chain started in the 1930s. A huge amount of the drug and human trafficking happening in the United States today is facilitated directly by the Hensleys, Bashas, McCains, and their cartel partners like El Mayo, El Chapo, and the Los Salazar family who runs Sonora. Drug laws are aggressively enforced in Arizona, but anyone operating under the McCain Associates umbrella, aka the CIA umbrella, gets a free pass. Because if they do get caught, the corrupt FBI Phoenix field office will call and order local law enforcement to stand down. The FBI can even stand down other federal agencies like the Border Patrol. One call is all it takes. They can also force Border Patrol to release anyone they catch or hand over any evidence that they collect. And it's perfectly legal because the FBI, by law, has jurisdictional supremacy over everything. I have many confidential sources in the Border Patrol who are very frustrated with the alarming frequency of those stand-down orders, especially in the Yuma to Vegas corridor where most of the real traffic comes in. Agents that will be leading patrols about to catch a bunch of smugglers out in the desert who, right as they're about to make the grab, will get calls from the FBI standing them down and forcing them to back off. And we don't need to take their word for it to see that the federal government is totally unserious about stopping trafficking in the Yuma corridor. We could just look at the publicly available numbers. If you look here, you'll see that Border Patrol keeps way less agents in the Yuma corridor than in the Tucson corridor. They claim it's because there's less traffic coming through Yuma, but anyone who knows Arizona knows that's a preposterous lie. The reason is simple: geography. The Tucson corridor is an unbelievably treacherous desert covered in sharp rocky hills, thorn bushes, and chollas, and doesn't have a lot of other foot traffic to serve as cover. So while there's many smugglers getting caught in the Tucson corridor, they're just the small fish that serve as decoys for the big boys coming through Yuma. The Yuma corridor is a relatively mild sandy desert with minimal vegetation and lots of random people riding around on quads and dirt bikes near both sides of the border. And just north of Yuma and east of Yuma are a bunch of bombing ranges used for training military pilots. Vast quarantined areas followed by huge wildlife refuges that make big-time traffickers unlikely to encounter any law enforcement as they make their way up to Vegas. Shipments are also brought through the grocery store bashes via underground tunnels and secretly loaded onto military planes at the Yuma MCAS airbase by the private refueling subcontractors, before being flown across the country to its final destination. Little known fact about the Hoover Dam outside Las Vegas is that it was originally built to control the water flow to Yuma so the mafia could extort the people, who are mostly farmers, into facilitating their smuggling. To this day, those same Depression-era crime families continue their gangbanging with impunity. Anyone who crosses them gets killed or railroaded by the feds, even Sheriff Joe. Sheriff Joe was king shit around here until he disobeyed a stand-down order, raided one of McCain's trap houses, and arrested one of Flaky Jeff's top aides red-handed. The second he did that, Sheriff Joe went from untouchable to being aggressively railroaded by the feds. Those sneaky little CIA Mormons seem innocent, but they do not mess around if you impede on one of their smuggling operations. That's why they've been getting into those vicious blood feuds with the cartels in Mexico lately. And they aren't the only ones doing sketchy stuff out here in Arizona. I also had the unique privilege of infiltrating a weird little NGO called Jewish Voice, a charity with embassy-level security that runs a hokey prosperity gospel-style TV broadcast network which fundraises tens of millions of dollars for foreign aid. It's weird though because they always seem to show up with tons of cash in the weirdest places at the weirdest times. Like Zimbabwe around the time Mugabe was taking power, Rwanda around the time those Hutus went crazy, and Ukraine right as those regime change protests were ramping up in 2015. Being there reminded me of that movie Lord of War with Nicolas Cage, because I knew much of the money pumped into those countries was actually used to buy weapons. If you've never seen it, you should check it out because it's a great depiction of how CIA arms trafficking to evil despots and dictators all over the world has skyrocketed since John took over command from his pops. Another great movie is American Made with Tom Cruise, depicting the CIA drug-financed gun running out of Arkansas. That covert operation is what laid the groundwork for the secret Clinton-McCain partnership. Super annoying how our government lets vicious gangs brutalize us in our own country to raise money for their foreign rackets. But equally annoying how our news media enables them. Because the corrupt stooges who run our government wouldn't survive long if journalists would ever report the truth. But they won't. They never have, and they never will. People like to think that fake news is a recent development. But the reality is that the news has always been fake. The term yellow journalism was coined way back in the 1890s to describe a media climate very similar to the one we have today, where 95% of all media is owned by 5 bloodthirsty corporations. Corporations who have no commitment to truth and no loyalty to the United States. Just endless greed and corruption. Now, many silly boomers will push back on that because they like to romanticize about how there was a time back in their day when the media at least tried to be objective. But that is hilariously false. The media in their day watched our president get trotted out in the open by his own security team, have his head blown off in broad daylight, and never pushed back a single time when it was explained away with a bunch of nakedly preposterous lies. Then they saw no issue with letting some of the co-conspirators in that murderous coup run the official investigation of it. Then they let not just 1, but 2 of those co-conspirators become the president, because the news has always been fake. Everything about the news industry in America is fake. Their esteemed heroes, Woodward and Bernstein, are the opposite of real journalists. They are actually Mockingbird stooges who were served up their bombshell stories on a silver platter by the crooked FBI as part of a highly coordinated CIA coup, similar to the Russiagate coup that the CIA coordinated against Donald Trump. Their top journalism award, called the Pulitzer Prize, was created by Columbia University after a bloodthirsty robber baron gave them millions of dollars to create a journalism school in his corrupt image. The kangaroo news media is a big part of the reason we had to do QAnon this way. Because if we didn't, the media's reputation might have survived intact, which would leave us vulnerable to more evil politicians in the future. Now that they took the bait, charged straight into our ambush, and rallied to the defense of obvious war criminals, racketeers, and pedophiles, nothing can stop what has come. They are all going down hard. And it's funny because they always act like us QAnon folks are the violent extremists. But they will get to see who the real violent extremists are very soon, when those left-wing mobs they've been sicking on us learn the truth about their treachery and turn on them. I reckon nothing will be able to save them then. Not even all those police officers they've been relentlessly slandering. So let them enjoy their last few moments on top. Because I have a feeling those smug kangaroo journalists are not going to fare very well out here in the wild. So with all that being said, I'd like to close with a public service announcement. Spooks, sicarios, and robber barons, be advised. D6 is officially canceled, and your treachery will no longer be tolerated. John McCain's despicable legacy will rest in the ash heap of history where it belongs. And anyone else engaged in acts of war against the United States of America better stop and disappear immediately. Or on behalf of the DIA, I will personally hunt them down and make a flamboyant example out of them. If you don't believe me, just ask Slimy Stanton's old amigo Paul Lopez. Things got a little bit heated between us after Paul decided to choose Team Satan over Team America. Hopefully the rest of you spooky little wanksters won't make the same mistake.